the Chinese and Asian national markets within a long national tradition. But without the Chinese Revolution or its reorganization of the social relations, it would be difficult to imagine how the traditional national market would transform into a new national market on its own. So on the other hand, like a small-scale peasant household family. So on the one hand, the revolution changed. We know that the collectivization of land, the people's common system. But after the Cultural Revolution, it's totally transformed. On the one hand, the small-scale peasant economy that takes the family households as its basic unit no longer exists. But on the other hand, household, family, and geographical relations have been reconstructed under the conditions of reform and through other means to fit within the new social configurations. The rural reform was a reform of the economic system, yet at the same time it was also built upon the social relations that were transformed through these experiments. So as for Yao Yang's perspective, the political precondition for the initiation of modern revolutions and the socialist histories by so-called neutral government is not their neutrality of moderation. Chinese socialism in practice strove to establish a state that would represent the so-called mass or the interest of the overwhelming majority. And these led to the break between the state or government and the special interests. At the level of theory, the state practice of socialism was a revision of the early Marxist class theory with Mao Zedong's work. So, including the 10 major relationships and the correction, all these issues. Because the main objective of the socialist state is to represent the interests of the overwhelming majority under the market conditions. Its connection and to special interest groups is looser than on other state forms. So at that time, but it's not the result of the neutrality of the government, but it's really the result of the early socialist moments. So we know that they talk about the class struggle and all these things were, but it's also, I think it's on the one hand, it causes a lot of the tragedies, problems. But on the other hand, there was a self-deconstruction of the party and the state in the 60s and the 70s. So made the state and the government, its relationship with the special interest groups was not really connected so much. That's why Yao Yang said there was certain kind of the neutrality of the government. Without that, it's not possible for the government to achieve the legitimacy for its early stage of reform. So even when Deng Xiaoping said that just allow some people become richer the first, no resistance, almost no large-scale resistance to that slogan and the policy change, which means that at that time, the ordinary people believed that the state will maintain the neutral. It's truly allow some people richer the first, and then allow another people to catch up with. But obviously the situation was not the case. But the legitimacy issue was, the legitimacy of the reform was achieved through these processes. Without these preconditions, it's difficult to understand why there was a partial policy, obviously, but there's still no resistance from the lower stratas at the beginning of the reform. So this is the one. But under the new condition of globalization, localization, and marketization, the conditions mentioned above are being significantly challenged. The foundation of social relations, economic life, and political subjectivities are undergoing change. If we are unable to grasp these new historical conditions and the direction of their change, it will be very difficult to construct structurally new and effective mechanisms and policies. To understand these transformations, I wish to point out some of the new tendencies in contemporary world. The first, traditional form of sovereignty is undergoing significant transformation under the globalization. Now, the current process of globalization appears to be manifesting primarily in two directions. The first is the transnational movement of capital, and thereby transnational production, consumption, and circulation, large-scale immigrations, and the market dependency that has arisen through the trade and investment, and the other various hazards of globalization as well. The second is the creation of international regulatory mechanisms to manage and respond to these transnational movements of capital and to control the risk. These include the WTO and the EU alongside other international and regional organizations. The former is something like anarchical forces, while the latter is a mechanism for harmonizing or controlling it. These two forces simultaneously came into effect. The shape of the national sovereignty will also inevitably change alongside these other important transformations. With the first trend just mentioned, particularly after the late 1980s has passed, China gradually began to take on the form of export-led economy. The transnationalization of production made China into the industrial workshop of the world, and these configurations differed completely from the forms of labor force and the resources development of the past, forging a new relationship between the coastal and the inland areas, and between urban and rural regions as well. With the gradual liberalization of the financial system, China's foreign exchange reserve shot up to become the largest in the world, and its economic development became highly dependent upon international markets, and especially the American markets. So that's why we know that Neil Ferguson used the term "Qi-American" to describe the symbiotic relationship between Chinese and American economies. Is perhaps a little exaggerated. Recently, he published another essay called "The End of the Qi-American." But in light of the transformation of these relatively independent national economies into the dependent economies or interdependent economies of very varying degrees, these concepts also have some very strong implications. As for a second trend, China has joined the WTO and other international treaties and agreements and actively participated in other regional organizations, such as that it is now difficult to describe China's structure of sovereignty in the traditional sense. The current financial crisis has shown that the crisis arises precisely from the shifts in the autonomy of societies, so that a crisis elsewhere can quickly become our own crisis. And these crises cannot be overcome simply by reasserting old ideas of the so-called sovereignty. So international cooperation cannot be avoided. Thus, under the conditions of globalization and the open global networks involved, the question of how to achieve new forms of, on the one hand, your autonomy, on the other hand, is opening. So, must be asked with reference to the history alongside the new explorations on the situation. The next, the role of state is undergoing transformation, not only within the realm of global relations, but in domestic relations as well. Simple descriptions of the role of Chinese state as a so-called, now is authoritarian to totalitarian, but on the other hand is so capable in managing the economy. And now the social policy was also changed for that. But the most important change, I think, now is the so-called the neutral state or the neutral government. The role of that at the beginning of the reform transformed, because we know that the different kind of the sectors of the state was penetrated into the interest relations. So that's why the social protest against the corruption was not only the individual officials, but the public policy were partial, like a real estate policy was made so many people angry, which means that the